You ever notice how some people mistake quiet for weakness? Because that and oppos. That's exactly what happened in a neighborhood called Pine Hollow Estates, a place with perfectly trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, and just enough HOA power to make ordinary people act like they were running a small kingdom. The man at the center of this story wasn't Oppos. T loud, wasn't Oppos. T flashy, and certainly wasn't Oppos. T looking for trouble. His name was Walter Grayson, 64 years old, retired surveyor, Vietnam-era veteran, widower, lived alone in the same house for nearly 3 decades. The kind of guy who waved when you waved first. The kind of guy who fixed things instead of complaining about them. The kind of guy most people barely noticed. And that was exactly why the HOA president picked him. Her name was Denise Caldwell. Now if you and Oppos, VE ever lived in a neighborhood with an HOA, you and Oppos, VE, probably met some version of Denise. Not all HOA leaders are bad, obviously. But every now and then you run into someone who starts believing that enforcing community standards is the same thing as ruling a kingdom. Denise loved authority, loved meetings, loved sending warning letters, loved reminding people about regulations nobody had thought about in 10 years. Most of all, she loved winning. And for nearly 3 years, Walter had become her favorite target. It started small. A letter about his truck. Then another about a shed visible from the street. Then another about paint colors. Then another about weeds. Then another about a crack in a walkway that sat entirely inside his property. Every few months there was something. Walter usually responded the same way. Calmly. Politely. Sometimes he paid the fine. Sometimes he appealed it. Sometimes he ignored it until the HOA realized they didn't and Oppos actually have authority over whatever they were complaining about. But he never argued. Never yelled. Never attended meetings. And that and Oppos. That's where Denise made her first mistake. She interpreted silence as surrender. One Saturday morning in early spring, Walter was outside working on a fence along the eastern side of his property. Nothing unusual. Just a retired man with a post-hole digger, a measuring tape, and a thermos of coffee. The sun had barely climbed above the trees when Denise pulled up in her white luxury SUV. She didn't and Oppos to even get out. Just lowered the window. That alone told you everything you needed to know. People who come looking for a conversation usually step out of the vehicle. People looking for an audience stay seated. Several neighbors were walking dogs nearby. A couple was jogging. A lawn crew worked across the street. Denise knew exactly who was watching. She leaned toward the window and called out. End quote. You and Oppos, re-putting that fence in the wrong place. End quote. Walter looked up, wiped sweat from his forehead. Didn't and Oppos say anything. Denise continued. End quote. Oh, we and Oppos, VE already checked. You and Oppos, re-way off the property line. When the survey comes back, you and Oppos, LL be paying to remove every single post. End quote. The dog walkers slowed down. The joggers stopped. You could practically feel people waiting for a confrontation. Walter glanced at the string line he and Oppos stretched between markers. Then back at Denise. Still calm. Still expressionless. Then he picked up another post and kept working. No argument. No defense. Nothing. That should have been the end of it. But Denise wasn't and Oppos interested in being right. She was interested in being seen being right. There and Oppos, a difference. So she drove away. And then came back. Twice. The second time she brought 2 HOA board members. The third time she brought a contractor. Now things started getting interesting. The contractor walked around with a clipboard while Denise pointed toward the fence. The board members stood nearby with their arms folded like they were witnessing a crime scene investigation. One neighbor later said it looked like a reality TV show nobody asked for. Walter kept digging, kept measuring, kept setting posts. Finally, Denise walked over. This time she wasn't and Oppos, smiling. End quote. We and Oppos, VE already filed a complaint with the county. End quote. Walter pressed gravel around a post. Didn't and Oppos, look up. Denise took another step closer. End quote. You and Oppos, LL have those posts removed by Thursday. End quote. Still nothing. Then she delivered the line she clearly rehearsed in the mirror beforehand. End quote. Save yourself the embarrassment and tear them out now. End quote. A few neighbors exchanged glances. Even they seemed uncomfortable. Because deep down, everybody knows there and Oppos. A difference between enforcing rules and humiliating somebody. Walter finally stood up, slowly, rested one hand on the fence post, looked directly at Denise, and said something that confused everyone standing there. And quote, "I and Oppos, D hold off on hiring any more contractors if I were you." End quote. That was it. No explanation, no threat, no anger, just a simple sentence. Then he went right back to work. Denise laughed. One board member laughed too. The contractor looked uncomfortable, and Walter continued digging. Now here in Oppos, the part nobody in Pine Hollow knew. Nobody except Walter, and maybe one county employee, because 3 weeks earlier, Walter had quietly submitted paperwork that almost nobody thought to investigate. You see, before retirement, Walter spent decades working in land surveying. Property records were practically a second language to him. Old maps, boundary descriptions, easements, deeds, historical filings. Most people see boring paperwork. Walter saw stories. And while Denise spent years obsessing over HOA bylaws, Walter had been reading something much older, something much more powerful, a set of property agreements dating back nearly 40 years. The original development documents. The ones most residents didn't and Oppos even know existed. The ones buried deep inside county archives. The ones that still carried legal force. And those documents revealed something very interesting. Something Denise never bothered to learn. Years earlier, before Pine Hollow Estates became a polished suburban community, the main access road entering the neighborhood had been built across privately owned land. The original developer received permission through a conditional easement agreement, an agreement containing language so specific that almost nobody remembered it. Almost nobody except Walter. Because Walter and Oppos' father had been involved in the original negotiations. Growing up, he and Oppos heard stories about those documents at the dinner table. Back then they sounded boring. Years later they became incredibly important. The easement contained conditions. One of those conditions involved property boundaries adjacent to the eastern section of the development. And recently, Walter discovered evidence suggesting the HOA had crossed one of those boundaries years ago. Not by inches, not by accident, by constructing a retaining structure during a landscaping project approved by Denise and Oppos' board. A project nobody had properly researched. A project everyone assumed was legal. A project that sat exactly where it should and Oppos' So while Denise was busy accusing Walter of building a fence in the wrong place, Walter had quietly initiated a formal boundary review with county officials. No drama, no social media posts, no neighborhood arguments, just paperwork, accurate paperwork. And if you and Oppos' ever dealt with property law, you already know something important. The loudest person in the room rarely wins. The person with documentation usually does. But Denise didn't and Oppos' know any of this. As far as she was concerned, Thursday was going to be a victory lap. The contractor would arrive. The county would support her complaint. Walter would be forced to remove the fence. And everyone would finally see who was in charge. What she didn't and Oppos' realized was that Thursday wasn't and Oppos' going to prove her right. Thursday was going to reveal a mistake so expensive that the entire neighborhood would feel the consequences. And by the time county officials arrived, the balance of power inside Pine Hollow Estates was about to change completely. Now, stepping out of the story for a second, because what's happening here isn't just neighborhood drama. It's a textbook HOA power conflict mixed with outdated land documentation, and honestly, I've seen versions of this go sideways more than once in suburban disputes across the U.S. According to standard procedure in county property enforcement cases, any boundary dispute tied to easements or historical deed restrictions automatically overrides HOA internal decisions until a formal survey or court clarification is completed, which means Denise's confidence was never actually backed by final authority, just assumption. From a legal perspective, easements are one of the most misunderstood parts of residential development. Because people think HOA rules are supreme, but in reality they sit far below recorded county land instruments, and those don't care about board opinions or neighborhood consensus. This is a psychological trap, authority bias mixed with silence bias. Walter wasn't weak, he was non-reactive, and people like Denise tend to escalate when they don't get resistance because they confuse calmness with submission until they walk straight into a structure they never bothered to research. Wednesday morning arrived, and with it, the rumble of county trucks, big, official-looking rigs with bright lights and orange cones, rolling down the access road that everyone in Pine Hollow Estates had taken for granted for decades. Neighbors peeked out from their windows, clutching coffee mugs, phones in hand, some whispering. "What's going on now?" Denise Caldwell was the first to notice, standing in the driveway of her own immaculate home with two board members by her side, clipboard in hand, ready to declare victory. She waved at the trucks, assuming they'd come to enforce her complaints about Walter's fence. What she didn't know was that those trucks were carrying something much heavier than enforcement notices. They brought closure, literally and figuratively, in the form of official road closure postings. Walter had timed everything with precision. The dispute he'd filed weeks earlier had triggered a county review, and according to the original easement terms, the HOA now faced a literal lockout. No one could drive through that eastern entry without Walter's permission or a new easement agreement. Denise's jaw dropped when a county officer stepped out of the truck, clipboard in hand, and handed her a notice. "You have 60 days to negotiate a new easement. Otherwise, access through this road is permanently revoked." The silence was deafening. The board members fidgeted, unsure where to look, and the contractor's clipboard almost slipped from his grasp. Walter, on the other hand, calmly tamped the gravel around a fence post, glanced up once, gave a slow nod, and continued working. Denise tried to speak, stammering about fines, property lines, and surveys, but Walter interrupted, almost gently. "The county has already ruled that your retaining wall encroached on my property. This fence is fully compliant with current survey data." He didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms. He just stated facts, undeniable and verifiable. The county officer nodded toward Walter, clearly aware of the meticulous documentation behind his claim. From a legal perspective, every form, every historical deed, every survey line had been accounted for. Denise realized too late that years of petty enforcement, letters, and intimidation meant nothing in the face of real property rights. She tried to argue further, but Walter raised a single finger, measured the next post along the string line, and said, "You might want to reread your own documents before sending anyone else here." The HOA board members slowly muttered among themselves, finally grasping the implications. If they didn't negotiate a new easement, the road closure would force every resident to take a 2-mile detour just to reach their homes. Panic replaced arrogance. Walter's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the flailing leadership of the HOA, and it became obvious his silence had been deliberate, strategic, and patient. As the day went on, residents began to understand the full picture. The quiet, reserved man who rarely attended board meetings had been holding every card worth playing, and now the neighborhood's most outspoken authority figure had to negotiate on his terms. The contractor packed up, the board left humbled, and Walter finished his fence, every post perfectly aligned, as if nothing had happened, though the weight of the day's events settled on the entire street. This was not revenge, not gloating, just justice in motion, executed with patience and precision, the kind of lesson Pine Hollow Estates would not forget anytime soon. What happened after that day in Pine Hollow Estates didn't look dramatic on the surface. No shouting matches, no viral neighborhood videos, no public meltdown, just a slow recalibration of power that most residents could feel but couldn't fully explain. And if I'm being honest, I've seen this same pattern repeat in suburban HOA conflicts more times than I can count across different states, different boards, different personalities, just with new names and new fences, because what people miss is that these disputes are rarely about fences at all. They're about control, perception, and the assumption that silence equals surrender. Walter Grayson went back to his normal routine almost immediately, coffee at sunrise, measuring tape in hand, finishing the last sections of his fence like the entire neighborhood wasn't watching him differently now, while Denise Caldwell became noticeably quieter in board communications. Fewer confident emails, more, "We need to review this internally" type messages, and that shift tells you everything about how quickly authority can evaporate when it stops being supported by enforceable structure. And from a psychological perspective, this is a classic escalation trap, where an authority figure misreads non-resistance as inferiority, which triggers increasingly aggressive enforcement attempts until they collide with a fixed point. Someone who actually understands the underlying system, according to standard procedure in municipal land dispute resolution, Once a recorded easement conflict is formally triggered with supporting documentation, the HOA loses unilateral enforcement power over any related boundary action until the county completes its determination, meaning every fine, threat, or contractor visit before that point is essentially performative, not legally binding in the way residents assume it is. And that gap between perception and reality is exactly where most HOA overreach lives. From a legal perspective, what Walter did, right, wasn't aggression or revenge, it was sequencing. He didn't argue the interpretation first, he secured the jurisdiction first. And that's a detail most people miss because they focus on the emotional layer of confrontation instead of the structural layer of authority. And this is where the real lesson sits, not in winning against an HOA, but in understanding that property systems in the U.S. operate like stacked hierarchies where recorded land instruments override community governance every single time. And this is a psychological trap that feeds itself, because the more confident an HOA board becomes in its enforcement identity, the less likely they are to verify the legal foundation beneath their rules, which means they often escalate disputes right into the exact documentation that limits them without realizing it. Walter, on the other hand, wasn't reactive, he was observant, and that difference is everything. He understood that silence is not absence of action, it can be preparation, it can be documentation, it can be timing. And in his case, it was all three, and when the county stepped in, it didn't feel like an intervention to him. It felt like confirmation. The lesson here is not that homeowners should try to beat their HOA, because that mindset usually leads to unnecessary conflict, but rather that every system of authority has boundaries defined by higher authority. And if you live long enough in one place, those boundaries matter more than opinions, personality, or neighborhood politics. And when residents like Denise forget that, they don't just create conflict, they create exposure for the entire structure they're trying to control. Months later, Pine Hollow Estates adjusted its policies. Meetings became more cautious, enforcement letters were reviewed more carefully, and residents who once laughed at Walter's quiet demeanor started paying closer attention to their own documentation because they learned something uncomfortable. Confidence without jurisdiction is just noise. And if you're listening to this story thinking about your own neighborhood, your own HOA, or that one dispute that never quite made sense, I want to leave you with this question. Have you ever misread someone's silence as weakness, only to realize later it was patience, strategy, or preparation all along? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I think this is one of those topics where everyone has a story, and the most interesting ones usually come from the people who never spoke up until it was already over.